So we have our models all set up, and now we need to write some database functions that allow us to interact with the database. And of course, we're going to do that not as a bunch of separate database functions. We'll attach all of the necessary methods or functions right to the types. So if I want to get all users, for example, I'll simply use the user type and add a function associated with it using a receiver. So I'm looking at the package data, the file models.go, and we need to make some changes in here that allow us to have access to that pool of database connections we created over in our main package. So let's make some changes. To start with, I'm going to declare a constant. And this is going to be called db timeout. And this is really useful anytime you're interacting with the database to use the context. And the context we're going to use will say, if this database access takes longer than whatever this constant is, then just cancel it. So we'll just set that to 3 seconds. And that's equal to time.second times 3. Okay, so that's my first constant. Now we'll declare a variable, db, which is of type SQL.db. And of course, we'll populate that using some kind of function. And I'm just going to call mine new. So a new function, and it takes one argument, db pool, of type pointer to SQL.db. And it's going to return a models type that doesn't exist yet. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a minute. But what we can do right now is say db is equal to db pool. Okay, now I'm returning that models type. It means I probably should create it. So I'm going to create a type models, and it's going to be a struct, and it's going to have one field, and the field is user of type user. Okay, so back up here in my new function, let's return models, which I have to spell right, and we'll give it one field. User is user, a new user object. Okay, so we now have this function new that returns a type of models, and that's going to have the field user. Now I may as well format this a little more nicely because ultimately we're going to be adding token as well. Okay, we can put token in there right now. Token. And down here, add token, and then save it to format it. Okay. So this will be a really simple way of having direct access to all of the database functions that are associated with the type user and with the type token. Now we don't have any at the moment, but we'll write one before too long. But of course, the fact that I've made changes here means I should go back to main.go and make some changes to this as well. So right now, if you look at our type application, this struct, we actually put the entire database pool in there like this. And that actually will work, but it might be simpler to actually, we'll get rid of that in a minute. Let's just add models of type data dot models right there. Okay, so that did the import for me up here. And now I can get rid of this db driver db, just remove it entirely. It's much cleaner just to put the models in there, and the models will actually hold the database type. So down here, I can't use this anymore because that doesn't exist. What I can do instead is say models is going to be assigned the value of from the data package. We'll call new, and we'll hand that our db.sql. And I think that is a lot cleaner. And it actually keeps our database completely separate from our handlers and from everything else. It's basically isolated. And if I want to replace that package with something that uses MySQL, I can do that. Okay, so let's go back to models.go. And what we can do here is we'll write one function right now, just to test things out. So right after my type user, and before the type token, I'm going to declare a function with the receiver of u, a pointer to the user type. So now this function will be tied to that type. And I'll just call it getAll. Okay? And it takes no parameters, and it's going to return a slice of pointer to user and potentially an error. Okay? Now, I'm going to be using the context, as you saw when we created this constant up here, db timeout. So that means I need it in this function. So I'll declare a variable, ctx for context, and cancel. And those two values are populated when I call from the context package, which is built right into the standard library, dot with timeout, that one, okay? And I'm going to use the default context background, which is always available to us, context.background. And my second parameter is that constant, db timeout, okay? And then we say defer, cancel. So if this takes longer than however long db timeout is set to, and right now that's 3 seconds, okay, then it will just stop this operation. Now we just write a simple database query. Query is assigned the value of, and I'll select ID and email and first name and last name and password and created at, try that again, created at and updated at from users. And I'll order them. Order by last name. So there's my query. And now I'll get all of my rows from the database. And of course, that'll be empty right now because there's nothing in there. But we'll put one row in there before too long. And we'll check for an error when we call, using that package level db, which is set when we call that new function back in the main package, dot query context. Query using the context. And we hand it the context we just made. And we handed the query we just made. And we check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, then we'll return nil plus the error. And then we don't want any resource leaks, so we'll say defer rows.close. And now we'll declare a variable to store our results in var users is going to be a slice of pointer to user. And now we just loop through our rows for rows.next. And we declare a variable to store the current row in. I'll call that user, and it's of type user. And we just say error is now assigned the value of rows.scan. And we scan into the variable user we just created. So a reference to user.id. And I'll just duplicate this a few times. So we get the ID, now we get the email. That's the second query parameter we have. Then the first name, and that's the next one up here, first name, then last name. Then password, try that again, password. I don't know where that came from, try that again. That's better. And then created at, and then updated at. And again, we check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, then return nil and the error. Something went wrong. But assuming we get past that, we just append the user we just populated to that slice of users above. So users is now equal to append, and we append it users and user. Now that's not going to work because this needs to be a pointer. That's no problem. We just put an ampersand in front of it, pass a reference to user instead. And once we get outside of this for loop, we just return users and nil. And that's all there is to it. So this is fairly straightforward, and we're going to have a number of functions, getting a user by email, all sorts of things like that, but we'll write them all as time goes on. What we'll do in the next lecture is put at least one row in the users table in the database, and then we'll write a handler that actually just uses this database function to make sure that everything works the way that I think it's going to.